My name is Robert Calloway. I am 67 years old, and for 39 years I worked as a structural inspector for the city of Richmond, Virginia, climbing scaffolding on buildings other men were too cautious to climb, signing off on the integrity of structures that thousands of people walked beneath every single day without ever once thinking about who had made the decision that the ceiling above them would hold. It was not glamorous work. Nobody writes songs about structural inspectors. But for 39 years, families went home safely because I did my job with a kind of stubborn precision that some people found admirable and others, including my own daughter, eventually found embarrassing. I want to tell you about the night my daughter Vanessa stood up at my retirement dinner in front of 42 people who had gathered to celebrate 4 decades of my working life and said the words that finally made something in me go quiet and still in a way it had never gone before. Then I want to tell you what happened 3 months later when she needed something only I could give her, and what happened after that, which is the part of this story I did not expect when I started living it. But first, you need to understand who Vanessa was before that night, because the woman who said those words did not appear out of nowhere. She was built slowly, over years, the way erosion builds a canyon. One small disrespectful moment carving into the rock until eventually there was a canyon and nobody quite remembered when it had started. My wife Diane died 9 years ago from ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the funeral. And I will not pretend that losing her did not change the shape of our family permanently. Diane had been the one who translated between Vanessa and me when we did not understand each other, which was often, because Vanessa took after her mother's ambition and her mother's sharp tongue without inheriting her mother's want to balance it out. After Diane died, there was nobody left to do the translating. Vanessa and I were left facing each other directly for the first time in 26 years. And what we found was that without Diane in the middle, we did not actually know each other very well. Vanessa had built a successful life by the time she was 34. She worked in corporate communications for a pharmaceutical company downtown, made considerably more money than I had ever made in 39 years of climbing scaffolding, and had married Preston Mills, an investment consultant whose family had the kind of old money that does not announce itself loudly, but makes itself known through small details. The watch, the car, the way he ordered wine without looking at the prices. I do not say this to suggest that money changed who Vanessa was at her core. I say it because money changed the room she stood in every day, and the room you stand in every day eventually changes how you see the rooms you used to stand in. The comments started small, the way these things always start. At a family dinner 2 years before my retirement, Vanessa was describing her work to Preston's parents who were visiting for the weekend, and when his mother asked politely what I did for a living, Vanessa said, "My dad does building inspections for the city," with a particular flatness in her voice that made it sound like an apology she was issuing on my behalf before anyone had asked for one. I let it go. I told myself she was simply nervous in front of Preston's parents, that everyone minimizes things slightly under that kind of social pressure. It happened again at Christmas the following year. Preston's father, a retired surgeon, asked me a genuine question about a downtown high-rise that had been in the news for structural concerns. And before I could finish answering, Vanessa interrupted with, "Dad's retiring soon anyway, so it's not really his world for much longer." I noticed the phrasing, "not his world," as though the work I had spent 39 years doing had been a temporary visa into a world that was never truly mine, and the expiration date was finally approaching. I said nothing. This was, I am aware now, my own contribution to the structure that eventually collapsed. I had spent my entire career understanding that small cracks left unaddressed become large cracks. I knew this better than almost anyone, and yet in my own family, I let the small cracks accumulate for years without ever once filing the report that would have required someone to take responsibility for them. I want to tell you about one more moment before the dinner, because I think it matters and because I did not understand its significance until much later. It was a Saturday afternoon in March, about 8 months before my retirement, and Preston had come by my house alone, without Vanessa, which itself was unusual. He said he wanted to talk through some financial planning ideas with me, the kind of thing a son-in-law might reasonably want to discuss with a father-in-law approaching retirement. We sat at my kitchen table and he asked careful, well-structured questions about my pension, about whether I had any other assets, about whether I had considered consolidating things for simplicity as I got older. I answered honestly but generally the way I have always discussed money, which is to say without specifics, because Diane and I had agreed decades earlier that what we had was our business. At one point, Preston asked, almost offhand, whether Walt and I still owned that old corner building downtown, the one we had picked up years ago. I remember being mildly surprised he knew about it at all, since I had never discussed it with him directly. I told him yes, that Walt and I still held it jointly. He nodded, made a note of something on his phone, and the conversation moved on to other things. I did not think much of it at the time. I filed it away the way I file everything. I understand now, looking back, that this was not an idle question. This was reconnaissance, conducted 8 months before the retirement dinner, by a man who had already begun identifying which parts of his father-in-law's life held value worth extracting and which parts did not. The retirement dinner was held at a private room in a restaurant downtown, the kind of restaurant Vanessa would have chosen, with exposed brick and dim lighting and a menu that did not list prices, which my co-workers from the inspection department found amusing in a way that told me they understood exactly whose world we were currently standing in. 42 people came, city colleagues going back decades. My brother Walt, down from Charlotte, a handful of old friends, Vanessa and Preston, my grandson Oliver, 11 years old, who I do not see nearly often enough, and who spent most of the dinner showing me something on his tablet about volcanic activity that he was certain I would find fascinating, and he was right. Around 9 o'clock, after dinner had been cleared, and the wine had been flowing for some time, my old supervisor Hank Difford stood up and gave a short, generous speech about my 39 years of service, about a building downtown that had failed an inspection under my watch in 1994, and how the contractor had been furious with me for weeks until the foundation issue I had flagged turned out to be exactly as serious as I said it was, and how 3 years later that same contractor had specifically requested me for every project his firm undertook, because he had learned that my signature meant something. People clapped. I felt for a brief window of time the particular satisfaction of being seen clearly for the work I had actually done. Then Vanessa stood up to say a few words, and the room quieted in the way it quiets when the person closest to the guest of honor begins to speak. She started fine. She thanked everyone for coming. She made a joke about how I had once spent 45 minutes at her college graduation explaining load distribution to a stranger sitting next to us who had asked an innocent question about the stadium architecture. People laughed. I laughed too, because it was true, and it was, I thought, an affectionate kind of true. Then she said, and I remember every word of this with a clarity I have never managed to lose. Honestly, it's nice to finally have a dad who isn't, climbing around on dangerous buildings all the time worrying us. Finally, someone useless no more. She laughed when she said it, a light laugh, the kind meant to suggest the words were not serious, that they were the kind of teasing affection daughters are permitted with fathers. But I watched her face while she said it, and there was no affection in it. There was relief. Relief that the version of me that had embarrassed her for years, the inspector, the man in the work boots and the city badge, was finally being retired into something she could more comfortably describe to people in her world. The room did the thing rooms do in that situation. A scattered, uncomfortable laugh from people who were not certain whether they had heard what they thought they had heard. Hank's face went very still. My brother Walt, sitting beside me, put his hand briefly on my forearm under the table. But it was Oliver I watched most closely. He was 11 years old, sitting between me and his mother, and he looked up at Vanessa with an expression I will not forget. It was not confusion. 11-year-olds understand more than adults give them credit for. It was something closer to disappointment, the specific disappointment of a child realizing that a parent has just said something they themselves know is unkind. He looked down at his tablet without saying anything. I noticed. I filed it away with everything else. Vanessa did not seem to register what she had said. She finished her toast, said something about loving me, raised her glass, and sat down. Preston touched her shoulder approvingly, a small private gesture, the kind two people share when something has gone according to a plan only they were aware existed. I noticed that too. The dinner continued. People talked about other things. I sat there with my hands folded on the white tablecloth, and I felt something I want to describe precisely because I think it is important. It was not anger. Anger arrives hot and immediate, and I did not feel hot. What I felt was the particular cold clarity of a man who has just received the final confirmed data point on a structural assessment he had been conducting without quite admitting it to himself for 9 years. I had been telling myself the cracks were small. I had been telling myself I was misreading the load. I was not misreading it. The assessment was complete. The structure, the relationship between my daughter and the version of me she had grown up watching climb scaffolding in work boots had failed. Walt drove me home that night because I had had more wine than I usually allow myself. In the car he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I heard what she said, Robert. I want you to know I heard it." I told him I knew he had. He shook his head slowly, looking at the road. "Diane would have said something right there at the table, you know that." I told him I knew that too, and that I was glad Diane had not had to hear it, and that I was not entirely certain yet what I was going to do, only that I was not going to pretend it had not happened, the way I had pretended for 9 years. I did not say anything that night to Vanessa. I drove, or rather Walt drove me, home, sat in my kitchen and did not sleep particularly well. I want to be honest about something else, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I am not a wealthy man by the standards of Vanessa's world, but I am not, as she apparently believed, a man without resources either. 39 years of municipal employment with a pension, careful investment of every overtime check Diane and I had ever earned, the sale of 2 rental properties Diane and I had purchased in the 80s when property in our part of Richmond was inexpensive and nobody else wanted it, and a modest but very real portfolio that I had built quietly over 4 decades without ever discussing it at family dinners, because Diane and I had always believed that what you have is your business and what you do with it is a private decision, not a performance for relatives. What Vanessa did not know, because I had never told her, was that I held a 51% ownership stake in a small commercial property downtown, a 4-unit retail building on a corner that had appreciated significantly over the past decade, purchased jointly with my brother Walt in 2009, when the building was nearly worthless and the area was considered undesirable. The other 49% belonged to Walt. The arrangement we had made, sealed with a handshake and later formalized through Raymond Pierce, my attorney of 22 years, was that any sale or refinancing of the property required both of our signatures. What Vanessa also did not know was that 3 years earlier, Preston's investment firm had taken an equity position in a development project that depended in part on acquiring and redeveloping that exact corner. I learned this not through Vanessa, who had never mentioned it, but through Walt, who mentioned offhand at the retirement dinner, before Vanessa's toast, before anything had gone wrong, that Preston's company had reached out to him directly the previous month, asking about the building. I had filed that information away the way I filed everything, quietly, without comment, the same way I had filed away 3 years of small comments about my own irrelevance, the same way I had filed away Preston's careful questions at my kitchen table 8 months earlier. 3 months after the retirement dinner, on a Thursday afternoon in late October, Vanessa called me. We had spoken perhaps 4 times since the dinner, brief, awkward conversations in which neither of us mentioned what she had said, the kind of silence that exists in families when everyone has agreed without discussing it to pretend something did not happen. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying a particular brightness I recognized from years of watching her prepare for difficult conversations. "I need to talk to you about something important. Preston's company is putting together a major redevelopment downtown and the corner building, your building, with Uncle Walt. It's actually central to the whole project. They need your signature to move forward with the sale." I sat with the phone for a moment. "The sale," I said. "Yes," she said, and her voice picked up energy now, the energy of someone who believed she had arrived at the easy part of the conversation. "Preston's firm is offering well above market value. It would be incredibly good for you and Uncle Walt financially. And honestly, Dad, it would mean so much to Preston professionally if this went through. This project could really define his career trajectory at the firm." I looked out my kitchen window at nothing in particular. "And you need my signature for this?" I said. "Yes," she said. "Just yours and Uncle Walt's." It's really just a formality at this point. Everyone's basically agreed already. We just need the paperwork finalized. I was quiet long enough that she said, "Dad, are you there?" "I am here," I said. "Vanessa, I want to ask you something and I want you to actually think about the answer before you give it to me. Why do you think I would say yes to this?" A pause. "Because it's a good deal, Dad. Because it would help Preston. Because..." She stopped. "Because what?" I said. "Because I'm asking you to," she said, and there was something underneath her voice now, something that sounded almost like genuine confusion, that the answer was not immediately obvious to me. I thought about the retirement dinner. I thought about 42 people in a quiet room, and my daughter's laugh, and the words, "Finally, someone useless no more." I thought about 9 years of small comments accumulating like sediment, and I thought about 39 years of understanding precisely how much weight a structure can bear before something underneath it finally gives. "Vanessa," I said, "do you remember what you said at my retirement dinner?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I knew the answer before she gave it. "I don't," she said, but her voice had changed entirely, lost its brightness, become smaller. "What do you mean? What did I say?" "You said it was nice to finally have a father who wasn't useless anymore," I said. I kept my voice level, the same voice I had used for 39 years delivering inspection results to contractors who did not want to hear them. "You said it in front of 42 people, including my closest friends, including the man who trained me when I was 28 years old, including your own son." "Dad," she said, that was a joke. It wasn't meant the way it sounded." I let that sit for a moment. "I have spent 39 years determining whether structures are sound by examining what they actually do under load," I said, "not what they claim to be capable of. You said what you said because some part of you believed it. The fact that it embarrassed you to say it out loud at a dinner does not mean it was not true the rest of the time, quietly, for years." "Dad, please," she said, and I could hear something clacking in her voice now. "This isn't about that. This is a business thing. Can we please just talk about the signature?" "I want you to understand something, Vanessa," I said. "I am not refusing because I am angry. I am refusing because for the first time in 9 years I am being honest with both of us about what is actually happening here. You only call when you need something from the version of me you find useful. The version of me that climbed scaffolding for 39 years. The version you called useless at my own retirement dinner. That version of me built something with my brother 14 years ago that your husband's company now needs. And the only reason I am hearing from you today is that the useless version of your father turned out to hold something valuable after all." She was crying now. I could hear it, and some part of me, an old and tired and very large part, wanted to soften, wanted to find a way to make this easier for her, the way I had made everything easier for 39 years. I did not soften. "I am not signing anything, Vanessa," I said. "Not because I want to hurt Preston's career, not because I am punishing you. I am simply done pretending that I do not notice the difference between how you treat me when you need nothing and how you treat me the moment you need something only I can provide." She said several things after that I was being unfair, that this was not personal, that one comment at one dinner should not define our entire relationship, that Preston's career was genuinely on the line, that Uncle Walt would probably say yes if I did not block it. On that last point, she was wrong. I called Walt that evening and told him about the conversation, and Walt, who had heard the toast at the retirement dinner himself and had gone quiet and pale at the time, told me without hesitation that his answer was the same as mine. "We are not signing anything, Robert," he said. "Not because the deal isn't good, because the way they asked for it tells you everything about what they actually think of you, and I will not reward that. What I have not told you yet is what happened 4 days later, because I think this is the part of the story that mattered most, and it is the part I did not originally plan to share, because it does not involve me coming out looking entirely composed. Preston called me directly. He had never once, in 3 years of marriage to my daughter, called me directly to discuss anything. He always went through Vanessa, which I had noticed and never commented on. This time he called my cell phone at 6 in the evening, his voice carrying the particular smoothness of a man who has rehearsed an approach and believes it will work. "Robert," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here, and I wanted to talk to you man to man, without Vanessa in the middle of it, because I respect you too much to let this turn into a family conflict over a business matter. I listened. I did not interrupt. 39 years of receiving contractor pushback had taught me that the most useful information often arrives in the first uninterrupted minute, before the other man realizes you are not going to argue back the way he expects. This deal, Preston continued, it's not just good for me, Robert. It's genuinely good for the city. We're talking about revitalizing an entire corner of downtown that's been underutilized for years. Your building, frankly, has been sitting there collecting rent from a nail salon and a sandwich shop when it could be anchoring something that brings real value to the neighborhood. I think if you look at this objectively, separate from whatever happened at the dinner, which, by the way, I told Vanessa was a poor choice of words on her part, you'll see this is simply the smart decision. I let the silence sit for a moment after he finished. Then I said, Preston, I want to ask you something directly, the way I asked Vanessa, and I would like a direct answer. Did you ask me about that building at my kitchen table in March because you were planning this deal even then? There was a pause, slightly too long. The kind of pause that told me everything before the words arrived. I was exploring a number of opportunities at that point, Robert, he said carefully. That conversation wasn't specifically about a deal that didn't exist yet. But you knew the corner mattered, I said. You knew it before your wife stood up at my retirement dinner and called me useless in front of 42 people. You knew it when she made that joke, and you put your hand on her shoulder afterward, like she had done something correct instead of something cruel. The smoothness in his voice cracked slightly. Robert, I'm not going to pretend that comment was appropriate, but I think you're connecting two things that aren't actually connected. The deal and the dinner are separate. They are not separate to me, Preston, I said. You are asking me to hand over something I built with my brother over 14 years, 3 months after your wife stood up in a room full of my friends and colleagues and told everyone that the version of me who built it was finally, mercifully, retired into irrelevance. I am 67 years old. I have spent my entire career determining whether structures hold weight honestly or whether they only appear sound until tested. I am testing this one now, and it is not holding. He tried several more approaches over the following few minutes. He mentioned that the deal would also benefit Vanessa financially, as though this would change my calculation. He mentioned that other investors were getting nervous about the timeline, which told me something useful about the actual pressure he was under that he had not intended to reveal. He said finally, with something approaching genuine frustration breaking through the rehearsed smoothness, that he did not understand why I would let one bad joke destroy a deal worth this much money to everyone involved. I told him it was not one bad joke. I told him it was 9 years of small moments that the joke had simply made visible to everyone else in the room. At the same time, it became visible to me. Then I told him I needed to go, and I hung up the phone. And I sat in my kitchen for a long time afterward, not triumphant, simply tired in the particular way that comes from finally saying out loud something you have been carrying silently for a very long time. The deal did not move forward. I want to walk you through how it actually fell apart, because I think the mechanics of it matter, and because I learned about most of it only later, in pieces, from Walt, and eventually from Vanessa herself. Preston's firm had structured their development proposal around a specific timeline tied to a separate financing arrangement with their primary capital partner, a private equity group based in Charlotte. That financing was contingent on the firm demonstrating control, or at minimum, a clear acquisition path over the full block, including the corner building Walt and I owned. Without our signatures, the acquisition path did not exist. Without a clear acquisition path, the capital partner's commitment, which had a hard deadline at the end of November, expired. I learned afterward that there was a meeting in early November in the firm's downtown offices, where Preston attempted to explain to senior partners why a deal he had personally championed and repeatedly assured them was secured had stalled over what he characterized internally as a family disagreement. I was not in that room, but Walt's friend Curtis, who worked in commercial real estate and had connections at the firm, told Walt afterward that the meeting had not gone well for Preston, that questions were raised about his judgment in representing the acquisition as secured before the signatures existed, and that the capital partner ultimately withdrew the financing commitment on November 30th when no resolution had been reached. The development project did not happen. The corner remained exactly as it had been. The nail salon and the sandwich shop continuing to pay their modest, reliable rent to Walt and me. The building continuing to be, in Preston's words, underutilized, which I had come to understand was simply his way of describing something that was not yet generating the kind of return his world considered acceptable. I heard through Vanessa, in a brief and bitter phone call in early December, that it had cost Preston the promotion he had been positioning himself for over the preceding 18 months, and that there had been significant conversations within the firm about his judgment in promising something he had not actually secured. I will tell you honestly that I did not feel triumphant when I heard this. I felt the particular heaviness of a man who has finally stopped absorbing damage in order to keep a fragile peace, and who understands that the cost of finally stopping is sometimes very high for everyone involved, including yourself. Vanessa did not call for 2 months after that. I spent that winter the way I had spent most winters since Diane died, quietly, with my coffee in the mornings, and old friends from the department who still called to check on me, and my brother Walt, who came by most Sundays now that the property situation had, in its own way, brought us closer together rather than further apart. I want to tell you about one of those Sunday afternoons with Walt, because it shaped how I thought about everything that came after. We were sitting on my back porch in early January, both of us with coffee, watching the bare trees in my yard, and Walt said something I had not expected. He said, "Robert, I need to tell you something I've been sitting on." He told me that 2 years before the retirement dinner, at a family barbecue I did not attend because I had been working a Saturday inspection, Vanessa had made a similar comment to a group of her friends about Walt himself. Something about how Walt and I were sweet old men who had never really understood how the real world worked financially, and that Walt had said nothing at the time because he did not want to cause a problem between Vanessa and me. I sat with that for a long moment. I asked Walt why he was telling me now. He said, "Because I think you deserve to know it wasn't just the one comment at the dinner. I think you deserve to know the pattern went back further than you realized, and that I was part of the reason it took this long for anyone to say anything, because I kept quiet too, the same way you did." I told Walt I was not angry with him. I understood, better than almost anyone could, the particular instinct to absorb a small disrespect rather than create a larger conflict over it. But I also told him that his honesty mattered to me, that it helped me understand the shape of what I had actually been dealing with for years. Not just one bad night, but a sustained pattern that several people in the family had been quietly protecting Vanessa from having to face. She called in January, around Oliver's birthday. My grandson's birthday was approaching, and she called, I think, because Oliver had specifically asked whether Grandpa Robert was coming, and Vanessa, whatever else had happened between us, was not willing to disappoint her son over a conflict with her father. We talked for a while before she said what I think she had actually called to say. "Dad," she said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the dinner. I looked back at it, what I actually said. I made myself remember it properly instead of just feeling bad about it in the abstract." She stopped. "I was cruel," she said, "and I think I had been quietly cruel for a long time before that, and the dinner was just the moment it finally came out loud enough that I couldn't pretend it wasn't real. I did not say anything immediately. I let her continue. I think," she said, "I think somewhere along the way I started believing that the things that mattered about you were the things that didn't fit into Preston's world, instead of understanding that you mattered regardless of which world you fit into. I'm not saying that to make this okay. I know it isn't okay. I'm saying it because I actually mean it, and I don't expect that to fix anything quickly." I sat with my coffee and looked out at my backyard, at the maple tree Diane had planted the same year Vanessa was born, bare now in the January cold, waiting for spring. "It will not fix quickly," I agreed, "but it is a real place to start, which is more than I have had from you in 9 years. I want to tell you about Oliver's birthday itself, because something happened there that I think mattered more than almost anything else in this story. Oliver turned 12 that February, and I came to the small gathering Vanessa had arranged, mostly children from his school and a handful of family. At one point, while the other children were occupied with cake, Oliver came and sat next to me on the porch steps and asked, without any particular drama in his voice, the way children asked the most important questions, whether I had been sad after the dinner. I told him honestly that I had been. He nodded slowly, the way Walt nods, the way Diane used to nod when she was deciding how much truth a moment could hold. He said, "I didn't think what Mom said was funny. I almost said something, but I didn't know if I was allowed to." I told him that what his mother said had not been kind, and that he had not done anything wrong by noticing that, and that one day, when he was older, he would understand that noticing unkindness and naming it honestly, even when it is difficult, even when it involves people you love, is one of the most important things a person can learn to do. He thought about that for a while and then asked if I would teach him how to read a blueprint sometime, because he wanted to understand what I had actually spent my life doing. I told him I would, and a month later I did exactly that. An entire Saturday afternoon at my kitchen table, watching my grandson understand, the way I once understood at his age, that the things holding a building up are mostly invisible, mostly unglamorous, and absolutely essential. We are rebuilding it slowly now, my daughter and I. She comes to Sunday dinner more regularly than she used to. Preston, I will say honestly, I see less often, and that is a separate matter that belongs to Vanessa's marriage and not to this story, except to say that the firm's senior partners did not forget the November meeting, and that Preston's position there has, in the months since, become noticeably less secure than it once was, a consequence that arrived entirely on its own, without any further involvement from me. I spent 39 years inspecting buildings that other people lived and worked inside, without ever thinking about the men who made sure the ceiling would hold. I understand something about invisible work. I understand something about being valued only for what you provide rather than for who you are. I am not angry at my daughter anymore, but I am no longer the man who absorbs every small disrespect quietly in exchange for peace. I learned, finally, at 67 years old, what I should have understood far earlier in my career and in my life. A structure that only holds weight in one direction, that is asked to bear everything and given nothing in return, is not actually sound. It only appears sound until the day someone finally asks it to bear one weight too many. That phone call about the signature was the weight too many. And the thing I am proudest of, looking back on all of it, is not that I refused to sign. It is that refusing finally taught my daughter and taught myself, and I believe is now teaching my grandson, what an honest foundation actually requires. Not silence in exchange for peace, not absorbing disrespect because raising it feels harder than swallowing it. An honest foundation requires both people to actually bear weight openly and to say something the moment a crack appears, instead of waiting 9 years for the ceiling to finally come down in front of 42 witnesses. I am 67 years old. I spent 39 years making sure other people's buildings would hold. It took me considerably longer to understand that the same principle applies to everything else worth building.